Stephanie Kelton is a professor at Stony Brook University. She was the former chief economist of Democrats on the US Senate Budget Committee and worked for Senator Sanders during the 2016 campaign to shape and define his vision of the economy for the American people. I think Stephanie quite likes her job as an academic at Stony Brook, but if she ever needed another one, she's got some pretty great references. A former US Labour Secretary called Stephanie a force in the next 15 years of shaping economic policy in this country. She got called by a sitting congressman a national treasure, and by Senator Sanders himself, who said she is one of the leading economists fighting to create an economy that works for all, not just the few. We're incredibly lucky to hear what she has to say about the way that budgets work, and not just that we can afford nice things, but what we should be spending on. Please give a really warm welcome to Stephanie Kelton.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ed and Ruby, and to all of the people at Get Up for the very kind invitation to come and spend some time here in Australia and talk with all of you, and thank you for coming out. Ed says I'm going to talk to you about budgets, and I can't believe that you're sitting here voluntarily and you've come to hear me talk about budgets, and I'm going to do a little bit of that, but what I really want to do is empower people so that when questions about some of these weighty things, like how will you pay for it, and what about the deficit, and what about the national debt, and all of this stuff comes up, regular people can fight back against bad stories, myths, narratives, the things that keep us from having nice things. The reason we can't have nice things is because the deficit, the national debt, how will you pay for it? I want you to be able to confront your elected officials when they give you this line that we sure would like to help you out, because we too believe that these things would be nice to have, but we simply can't afford it. So I want to move into this. I also would like to take my shoes off, if that's okay, because my mother will watch this, and so she thinks it's important that I wear nice shoes. But honestly, I couldn't care less. I just would like to be comfortable. So you heard that I work for Senator Sanders. Senator Sanders is a big ideas guy. He is not an incremental, marginalist, tinker around the edges. He is someone who is not afraid to fight for big things. Okay, so when I worked for him, and he decided he was going to run for president, he had a 12-point agenda. This was essentially the presidential platform. And on this agenda were some pretty big things. $1 trillion of infrastructure, dealing with climate change, making public colleges and universities tuition-free, universal health care. Can you believe it? We don't have it. Right? But big things, and the big things cost what? Big bucks. Big bucks. Where are you going to get trillions and trillions of dollars for your agenda? Ha ha, the cartoonists had a field day, right? Hi, Senator, I love all the free stuff you want to hand out. How are you going to pay for it? This is really what anyone is up against who proposes to do big things. How will you pay for it? So what I want to suggest is that progressives need to be empowered to talk about the answer to this question in a very different way from the way that we have been doing it for way too many years, because guess what? It ain't working for us. It is not working. So we have to find a different way to talk about taxes and deficits and money and answer this question that if you can't get past that hurdle, you can't pass your agenda. You better have a compelling answer to this question. Because guess what if you don't? They will mock you, and they will say that you are pie in the sky, and that it's all impossible, and it's unrealistic, and this is what happened to Senator Sanders. This is what they attempted to do. Okay, so this little excerpt here is from Hillary Clinton's book, the book that she wrote after the campaign was over. What Happened was the title of the book, and in the book, she describes how frustrating it was to run against Senator Sanders. And she says, look, I would offer to do $250 billion of infrastructure. And he'd offer $1 trillion. I would offer to help make college more affordable for families that make less than $125,000 a year. He said, make it free for everyone. Every time we said something, he went bigger, right? And in the book, she recounts a story where she says it was like somebody said to her, Bernie says, I think America should get a pony. And Hillary, the more responsible adult in the room, says, how will you pay for the pony? Right? This is the way that this was characterized. So she goes on to say, look, you cannot cut taxes or increase spending unless you can pay for it. You cannot do these things. But guess what the Republicans just did? Passed massive tax cuts, disproportionately skewed to the people at the very top, and did not, quote unquote, pay for it. They added to the deficit. No problem, okay? But the progressives and Democrats think that somehow it's more responsible to pay for everything. That you've got to offset any spending that you want to do with cuts in other parts of the budget or with new taxes somewhere, okay? This is the way that different parties think about things. So, look, here is Senator Sanders, and the rhetoric that he's up against, and that the progressive agenda is up against, is that we've got a problem when it comes to the idea of deficit spending. We're allergic to it. We think it's irresponsible. We want the government to balance its budget. We've been told that that's the right thing to do. Deficit spending is irresponsible. We must not do that. So Hillary said you have to go where the money is. You've got to pay for things. Well, where is all the money? Well, all the money is in the hands of the rich. And so if you need to pay for things, you have to go where the money is, and that means go to the rich people. They have all the money. Okay, and you take their money away and you give it to the poor and you fund programs, and that's the right thing to do. And you say, okay, well, look, it seems logical, it seems like a good idea, but it puts you in a position where you have to win on two fronts. You have to both convince voters that the big ideas you're fighting for are good policy, and you have to extract some money from the people who have it. In other words, you have to successfully win on the tax front and win on the spending front. You've set yourself up to have two fights, and you got to win them both, or you can't have what you want. You can't have nice things. And it also means you need the rich. You need them because they're your meal ticket. You see, you can't feed a hungry kid. You can't fix your crumbling infrastructure unless and until you can scrape some money away from the billionaire class or whomever, Wall Street, who's got the money, right? And until we can succeed in stripping away a few bucks from the rich, we can't care for our planet, for our communities, for our children, for our people, right? So you get this question, who will pay for it? How are we going to pay for it? Look, we need infrastructure investment in a major way in the United States. We have deferred maintenance for decades. We have crumbling infrastructure. We have more than $3 trillion of needed infrastructure investment. Senator Sanders proposed taking a bite out of the problem, doing $1 trillion of infrastructure investment. People said, how will you pay for it? The answer was, we'll close some tax loopholes, right? We'll go after the money that's offshore. Not that you shouldn't do that. Not that you shouldn't do that. But in saying we can't fix the infrastructure unless and until we can win on this tax front, guess what? You don't get to fix your infrastructure unless you can get over that hurdle, right? So then he says, let's make public colleges and universities tuition free. And they say, how are you going to pay for it? And he says, we're going to have a financial transactions tax on Wall Street speculation. Okay, it sounds like a good idea. If you want to discourage Wall Street speculation, a tax is the right way to go. But again, you can't make public colleges and universities tuition free unless you can impose a tax on trades in the financial markets, and that makes you what? Dependent on Wall Street. So you need Wall Street speculation going on so that you can tax it, so that you can fund public colleges and universities. So there's something crazy going on with the way that we do this pay-for game, where we set ourselves up to target a revenue source that is Wall Street speculation, which is something we actually don't want, but we're dependent upon it now because it's our pay-for. You see? So I suggest that it's time that we start rethinking the purpose of a tax. Why do we tax? The way that we think about it, I'll bet almost everyone in this room thinks that the government taxes us because it needs our money to pay for the stuff that they do. Okay? We fund the government. They need your money, right? They need your money. That's how we think of it. You need to tax me to get money to pay for all of these things on your agenda. This is the wrong way to think about the tax. Okay? Governments tax for a variety of reasons. Taxes are important for a variety of reasons, but one of them is not funding the federal government. That is not what the tax revenue does. We shouldn't even use the word revenue. The tax allows the government to introduce a currency to get the rest of us using it. The government says, I'm going to make and receive payments in the Australian dollar. Suddenly the Australian dollar becomes the dominant currency in Australia. When Germany and other countries in Europe said, we're no longer going to spend and tax in Deutschmarks and Lira and Drachma, we're going to spend and tax in the euro. Suddenly, the euro becomes the dominant currency in that era. So the tax does something important. It makes the rest of us need the government's money, not the other way around. Okay? The tax is important because it's a way for the government to remove income from the rest of us to make some room for the government to spend into the economy. It allows the government to spend money on infrastructure, education, healthcare, and other things without creating an inflation problem, reducing the value of the government's money, because they tax some of it away as they spend in. That prevents the inflationary pressure. So taxes allow the government to move resources into the public domain without causing an inflation problem. So think of the tax as a way to offset the risk of inflation. Taxes are important because they allow the government to affect the distribution of wealth and income in the economy. So we would be perfectly happy to see the government raise taxes on some percentage of the population because the concentration of wealth is too great. There's too much income in the hands of a certain small minority of the population. This is bad for the way the economy functions. It's bad for democracy. Tax some of it away, okay? That makes perfect sense. Taxes are important because they change behaviors. You can incentivize or disincentivize behaviors through the tax system. If you want to see people do more economically, environmentally friendly things, you might have an incentive to say, go green, right? Drive an electric car. You can use the tax system for that. You can discourage behaviors by putting a tax on something like carbon or cigarettes, right? Or alcohol. You can discourage. So taxes are important for those reasons. The last one I'm not going to really talk about. You might just want to keep track of certain things. So this is a guy called Beardsley Rummel. He was the head of the New York Federal Reserve Bank. So he's a banker, right? A businessman and a banker from the 1940s. And he goes through all of this stuff. And he explains after the U.S. went off the gold standard, in his paper titled Taxes for Revenue Are Obsolete, he says the government doesn't collect tax because it needs revenue. It collects tax for all these other reasons. Okay? Head of the New York Fed. Smart guy. Okay, so look at this picture again. Why would you tax Jeff Bezos and the family that owns Walmart, the Walton family, and the Koch brothers? I mean, we hear about these people. Why would you tax them? Is it because you need their money to feed a hungry kid or fix a crumbling bridge? No. Why you would tax them is because they have too damn much money. They have too much. It's not that they're not paying their fair share. It's that they're taking more than their fair share, much more than their fair share. This is why workers aren't getting the raises that they deserve. This is why pay equity between CEOs and the average rank and file worker is so different. They don't pay their fair, they're taking more than their fair share. That's the problem. And so you go after these guys to bust up the concentration of wealth in their hands, not because you can't care for people without their help. We don't need them. We don't need them. Okay, why would you tax Wall Street? You don't tax Wall Street because you need a few bucks to fund another program. You tax Wall Street because you say Wall Street speculation is really bad for the way that the economy works, right? All this speculative activity drives bubbles and causes busts in the economy. People lose their jobs and their homes and their income and their savings. And so we want to shrink the size of Wall Street, not become dependent upon Wall Street speculation. Okay, so we have a lot of things backwards. Here's how we think about it. When we think about the way the government spends, we say, who's going to pay for it? You want to do something, who's going to pick up the tab? Right? Tab, right? Who's going to pick up the tab? The tab is taxing and borrowing. We think that the government collects taxes or borrows money in order to get money that it then later spends. Taxing and borrowing comes first. Spending comes after the government has raised the money, right? This is the way we think about it. This is not correct. The way it really works, and I say this as a former chief economist on the Senate Budget Committee, the way it really works in the US is that Congress puts a budget together. The House and the Senate write a budget. They say, this is how much we want to spend on education. This is how much we want to spend on defense. This is how much we want to spend on infrastructure. They write down a budget, and then they pass a budget, and there's an appropriations, right? An authorization to spend the money. So what happens is the spending comes first. The government decides what it's going to spend on a variety of programs. After it spends, people have the money that they then send back a portion of in the payment of taxes, and then the government steps in if there's a deficit and borrows some of the money it left behind by running its deficit. We could get really weedy here. I'm not going to unless you have follow-up questions, but that's the way it works in practice. The spending comes first. The government is not like the rest of us, okay? This is the fundamental problem. We think of the government like a household. So you hear the words, you hear people say, you have to get your fiscal house in order, right? That language, the house, the fiscal house. Governments need to balance their budgets, live within their means, tighten their belts. All of that austerity language is meant to tell us that the government should behave just like one of us, right? No. The government is not like one of us. And the big difference between them and us is what? They control the currency. They issue the money. That's where the currency comes from. If I had my own printing press, right? If I could create the money, I wouldn't worry about going broke. I wouldn't worry about bills that I can't pay. I wouldn't worry about the cost of something, affordability, right? But I have to worry about all of those things. And the federal government doesn't. It gets to write the budget, put the numbers in, and then the checks go out, right? And the checks don't bounce. The federal government's checks don't bounce. All right, so money matters. Understanding the monetary system, if an elected official comes up and tells you, I would love to be able to do it, but there's just no money, you say, bull. Don't tell me, because I know where the money comes from. Right? And you have the patent. If it's the Australian government, they literally are the only entity on earth with the authority to create the Australian dollar. No one else can do it. Where else would it come from? It doesn't come from China. You're not dependent upon us to get Australian dollars. They come from you. We can't get them until you spend them into the economy. Right? And so this idea that somehow it's irresponsible for the government to put more money into the economy than it takes out. Spend 100 in, tax 90 out. That's government running a deficit, spending more than it takes in. But guess what? When they spend 100 in and they only tax 90 out, somebody gets left with 10. That's your surplus. Their deficit is your surplus. Now, how will you pay for it? How should progressives answer this question? Here's one way. This is the way that Senator Brian Schatz has answered the question. He is a U.S. Senator from the state of Hawaii. And he is proposing debt-free college. And so he was interviewed by journalists who said, oh, debt-free college, that sounds awesome. How will you pay for it? And he just said, no, I'm not going to answer that question. I reject the question because why is it that it's only progressive proposals that get confronted with this question, but conservative with the tax cuts and so forth, you never have to answer that. So I think it's a trap, and I won't answer it. That's one way to handle it, because guess what? It's a trap! It is a trap. It is a trap. What they're really asking isn't how will you pay for it. What they're really asking is who will pay for it. Because what they want to do when they put this question forward, how will you pay for it, is divide us up. They want to divide us up. Because if you say, we'll pay for it with an increase in the payroll tax or a tax on wealthy, then we can start fighting over who bears the burden of the increased tax. And if they can get us all fighting amongst ourselves, then we don't get the policy, and they know that. So asking that question is meant to stop it in its tracks. You won't get beyond where you're trying to go because of this question. Who will pay for it? Get everybody fighting. The Republicans, bless their hearts, they are onto it. They understand the game. This is Dick Cheney. He was vice president under George W. Bush, you may remember. He famously quipped that Reagan proved deficits don't matter. Reagan proved deficits don't matter. So look, here's what they mean. Here's what they mean. The Republicans just passed $1.5 trillion in tax cuts. This is over 10 years, estimated. And why would they do that? If the Republicans genuinely cared about deficits and thought deficits were dangerous and a threat to our security and all of this kind of stuff, they wouldn't do it. They would not do it. They know that this is a lie. They know that deficits enrich someone. They know the government's deficit becomes someone else's surplus. So guess what they do? They enrich their donors. They enrich corporations. They know that by cutting deficits, they're creating surpluses in someone else's pocket. So this is actual data for the US. Your data would look the same. Well, in the sense that it would move in opposite directions. The government's financial balance is shown there in red. You can see the government in the US is almost always in deficit, but the private sector in the US is there in black. And you can see how the lines move in opposite directions, which means as they run bigger budget deficits, we get bigger financial surpluses. Their red ink is our black ink. So when they say deficits are bad because they hurt you, they're lying to you. Deficits put more money in someone's pocket. The question is, whose? Whose? And for now, the Republicans are the ones wielding the power of the purse, and they're putting the money into the hands of the very wealthiest people and the corporations, the people who least need the help. And when the Democrats get in control, God willing, they will understand that when they have the power of the purse, they can direct those resources in a different direction, rather than trying to tighten up the purse strings and balance budgets. Okay? So here's one way that I think progressives could answer the question, how will you pay for it? Every time you want to fight for something big, how will you pay for it? You simply say, the Reserve Bank of Australia will clear any payment authorized by Parliament. It has the benefit of being true. And so, it's so simple, right? It is so simple. And it puts the onus on Parliament. You write the budget, and once you write the budget and decide where you want to put resources, that's where the resources will go. That's how it's paid for, okay? So does that mean that we can have all the spending in the world? There are no limits. Since the government controls the currency and can write the numbers on the budget, we can fund everything to the infinity power, right? Does that mean that? No, that doesn't mean that. Okay, so as Hillary said, everybody gets a pony? No, no. This is a piece I did for the LA Times, an op-ed, earlier, I guess it was last year around this time. And they gave it this awkward title, but it works in this context. And so the piece is, everybody can have a pony, sure, where the pony is a metaphor for Medicare for all, or free public colleges, or infrastructure, or child care, or whatever, right? And so here's what I say in this piece. No, it doesn't mean the government can buy absolutely everything it wants at any price. There are limits. So what are the limits? Every economy has essentially an internal speed limit. There is only so much available to buy. There are only so many people you can hire. There's only so much machinery and factories that are there to work with. So the constraints are real. They're in the economy. There are limits. And if you try to run beyond those limits, if you try to outstrip them, what happens? Inflation. So the risk is not bankruptcy for the government. It's not insolvency. The risk is inflation. And if you are abusing the power of the purse, you will create an inflation problem in your country. You will not go broke, but you will create a bad situation. So you do have to be fiscally responsible, but fiscally responsible means honoring the real limits that exist, right? And so you do have to prioritize. You can't do everything. So I'm getting very, very close to the end here. I think that budgets should be mission-oriented. It should be clear to the people when governments put a budget together, what are the objectives? Why are you writing this budget? What problems are you trying to solve? Make it concrete. Make the goals explicit and say, we're trying to eliminate child poverty in 10 years' time. We're trying to completely eliminate the infrastructure deficit in 5 years. We're trying to, set concrete goals, balance the economy, not the budget. The budget is your tool. The budget is a vehicle through which you can divert resources, financial resources, to solve real problems. Right? Use the budget. And if you get a deficit of 3.5% of GDP, and that delivers a good economy, who cares if it's 3.5% of GDP? If it takes you 5% of GDP, who cares? If you have a good economy, low inflation, you're solving real problems, the number that gets scrolled down in some government office and called the deficit is irrelevant. Okay? Prioritize. Of course you can't do everything. You have to prioritize. Hit meaningful objectives. Respect the limits. And I would suggest start by employing everyone in the economy who is looking for a way to participate, who wants to work, and can't find it anywhere else in the economy. That is one of the biggest mistakes, grave errors that we make. Look, when people are unemployed, what happens? It's not just an economic problem. It's not just that you don't get the output that they would have produced. It's all of the social ills that go with it. It's the depression. It's the anxiety. It's the loss of sense of purpose. It's what happens when families break down, spousal abuse, substance abuse, all of those associated problems increase. We've got, in this country, you have, 700,000 people officially unemployed, 1.1 million underemployed. You've only got a couple of 100,000 job vacancies. So there are far more people looking for ways to contribute than there are opportunities, right? So let the government start by creating employment for anyone who wants to work and can't find it anywhere else in the economy. This is one way. I'm done. This is one way, and perhaps the best way, to begin to exercise the power of the purse. And so This is the last slide. So very, very quickly, this taxpayer myth, you got to knock that down. Okay, this is Margaret Thatcher famously saying, "There is no public money. There is only taxpayer money." Don't accept that. That's baloney. There is public money. She's wrong. She just doesn't want you to know there's public money because that's how they get us fighting. Right? The taxpayer who will pay for it. Then they get us fighting. No, there is public money, and you can use the public purse to fund programs. You just have to be careful about inflation. The deficit is not a problem. Deficits are normal and perfectly responsible, provided that the government is not creating inflation because it's running too big a deficit, or doing what the Republicans are doing and using deficits to exacerbate inequality. That's not a responsible use of deficits. But deficits are perfectly responsible if they're deployed in the interest of the public good. Last thing is this money myth, this idea that the government has to find the money. There is no money. We're out of money. We'll go broke. No, not in a country like Australia, not in a country like the US. The governments of Australia and the US never need to, quote unquote, find the money. You control the power of the purse. And whatever is technically feasible is economically doable. Okay? So with that, I probably went a little long, apologize. I'm going to turn it back over to Ed. And thank you so much.